morning, BookTube. I have a serious case for you today, the case of the wonky data. I am actually talking on a topical issue today. I didn't intend to. I usually try to stay away from that, as you know. I read things hundreds of years old and prefer it that way. However, this issue is both important and there's something important that needs to be said about it that I haven't heard yet, as well as the fact that my tiny library, my tiny English section of the Bangkok Library, actually had the book that's going to allow me to address this issue. Crazily enough. It's called The Honest Truth About Dishonesty. It's by Ariely, Dr. Dan Ariely. Where do we begin with this case? Well, it's a case of fraud. I'll tell you from the get-go, spoiler alert, guilty, at least in my eyes. Some of this is still playing out, but some of it is pretty much reaching its conclusion. These are social scientists, highly respected academics, who, among other issues, write about honesty and have been caught falsifying data. And the reason that I want to address this, I've been told not to bury the lead with YouTube. Since not everyone will watch through to the end of this, I want to say this right up front in the beginning of this discussion. Before anyone goes off and says, look, see, we can ignore all these experts and scientists who teach us about the world and what we ought to do because they're just as bad as us. No. Yes, they are. They're humans, and these people made bad choices. But it's important to remember they've been caught. We're here to talk about how they have been caught. Many people, analyzed the data, tried to replicate the findings of their studies, and were not able to. Found exactly where the data was manipulated and probably how. Found that it was probably not a mistake. And therefore these people and their work, unfortunately, much of it, will not be credited academically in the future. So let's start with, we're going to mainly focus on Dan Ariely today. There's also a collaborator of his named Francisco Gino. Her case is a little bit more advanced. They've completed a 1-year investigation by the university that found that there was fraud in the data, and as well as she took it to the courts, and as of last week, I think, lost her court battle, which is why this is very much popping in the news right now. Well, I think I've read Mr. Ariely's confession. In this book, he more or less tells us what he's going to do, or maybe has already done. Let's look at some of the details. Let me read you a tiny section to start. It says that although the focus of the various experiments presented here were on dishonesty, it is also important to remember that most of the participants in our experiments were nice people from good universities who will likely attain positions of some power and influence later on in life. They were not the kind of people one typically associates with cheating. In fact, they were just like you, me, and most of the people on this planet, which means that all of us are perfectly capable of cheating a little bit. While I might agree that academia is not necessarily often associated with cheating, I would argue that other authority figures such as financiers, politicians often are. And I think it's important to note that both Dr. Ariely and Dr. Gino uh, had at least another foot, one foot in the business world, as in the academic world, doing all kinds of consulting for all kinds of high-powered things and bringing in tons and tons of money. So who knows which side corrupted which, but my reading of them is that they were moving more in the business world and moving out of their purely academic ivory towers. So here we have a little sort of apologia pro sua vita in advance here as Dr. Ariely prepares his defense, I think. He mentions, for example, well, first of all, he minimizes. He minimizes lying quite a bit in here. He's got a whole chapter on it as addressing golf. It's just a game. Truth is just a game. He's got one talking about how creative people lie more. Lying is creative. We're all storytellers, he says. It's just telling stories. He talks also about white lies in the gray world. He's preparing here an environmental defense, right? The world is gray. I'm just going along with the flow, right? Officer, we were all speeding. Why did you pull me over? He's also preparing a bit of a sort of medical defense. He talks about the dishonesty gene. He talks about an epidemic, the spreading of this germ, not gene, germ. Let me read my own writing. Germ. The spreading of this germ through collaboration. He's already telling us that perhaps he and colleagues like Dr. Gino form cabals, right? When they come together, it's easier to cheat collaboratively. So, again, why are you picking on me? There were a bunch of us. Makes a sort of economic defense. This is a little bit less clear. Talks about, I guess, FOMO, opportunity cost. Economics, you have this sort of couple bad assumptions at the beginning of it. You've got this assumption of scarcity, right? Buckminster Fuller gives an interesting alternative economics to this that doesn't posit scarcity. And you've also got this assumption of rationality, whereas what we know, we make most of our economic choices emotionally. I actually taught economics for a while at Thammasat University here in Thailand, and I gave them an interesting thought experiment. This is a bit more poli-sci than econ, but I used John Rawls' idea of the veil of ignorance, the original position. That is to say, you're going to make your rules for your society, but you have no idea what gender, disability status, ethnicity, race, etc., you might be in this society. So this sort of veil is supposed to create a kind of even playing field. It was very interesting. I've done it in different countries where I've taught, and the Thai case is very much influenced by the fact that it's difficult for them to exactly do this, especially females, so you can't really be a monk, which is a very high prestige position here. But because of this king, so if it's hard to even imagine, what if I were king. So I didn't explain that part very well, but I didn't understand it very well either. So we also have, he does do a little bit of looking at lying across culture. He does this test where he gives people, he pays a certain percentage of their beers. It's quite interesting. It reminded me of the case of 9/11, wherein there had been an article prior to 9/11 saying, listen, the United States has absolutely no intelligence in the world. We don't cultivate partners, and we're stuck in a cold world format wherein the modus operandi is for agents to go to the nicest hotel in town, and invite people to the bar there, and get them drunk and ply them with drinks, and get information that way, which obviously doesn't work in the Islamic world that doesn't drink. So I thought this drinking test was a bit odd. So he came up with a conclusion that sort of people did not cheat more than Americans, even like a case where like maybe the Chinese, where his Chinese colleague or friend anticipated that they would. But this is kind of strange, right? Because you're looking at just cheating, whereas honesty involves a lot more than cheating. So, for instance, I remember one of the big issues in China for expats didn't so much bother me, but some expats were very bothered by the Chinese lying, which might be something like you're in a group and you might say something to one person, and then in the same group in front of everyone might say something different to another person over here, which could seem contradictory if you're not involved well in the whole Chinese system of understanding. And this is why I want to tell this story. I hesitated, but I really want someone to debunk this if it's not true. What I was told is that if anyone, Chinese person, were to call out that person, like, hey, you said this to him and this to her, it would be that first person calling out the discrepancy and sort of troubling the waters. That person would be the one that sort of lost face or was bothersome to the group, not the person who had said X, Y, or Z, just sort of smooth the group interaction. Anyway, so that wasn't really developed very much either in the book. Okay, let's get into the nitty gritty. The fudge factor. Spends quite a bit of time on the fudge factor. Read you a little bit about it. So if you think the world of medicine is rife with conflicts of interest, he keeps going after dentists. He has a real hatred of dentists for some reason. I well understand him. I had a tooth out a couple weeks ago. In this case, he's talking about how dentists buy machinery that costs a lot, and after that, they tend to diagnose a lot more people needing that machine. And he was called out in one case. He said on a televised interview that dentists, when they look at x-rays, only concur on the cavities, like 50% of the time, whereas you'd expect it to be like 90% of the time. In fact, he sort of said, I don't know if it was a throwaway line, but said something like, oh, they all find cavities, but in different teeth. Later, he was called out on that. People asked him to produce the data. Where did he come up with this figure? And he was unable to do so. Anyway, so he's talked about the medical field, and now he's going to go into finance. He has to talk about the wonderland of financial services. Say it's 2007, you've just accepted a fantastic banking job on Wall Street. Your bonus should be in the neighborhood of $5 million a year, but only if you view mortgage-backed securities in a positive light. You're paid a lot of money to maintain a distorted view of reality, but you don't notice the tricks that your big bonus plays on your perception of reality. Instead, you are quickly convinced that mortgage-backed securities are every bit as solid as you want to believe they are. Once you've accepted that mortgage-based securities are the wave of the future, you're at least partially blind to their risks. On top of that, it's notoriously hard to evaluate how much securities are really worth. The gray world. You sit there with your large and complex Excel spreadsheet full of parameters and equations, you try to figure out the real numbers. You change one of the discount parameters from 0.934 to 0.936, 0.002. And right off the bat, you see how the value of securities jumps up. You continue to play around with the numbers, searching for parameters that provide the best representation of reality. But with one eye, you also see the consequences of your parameter choices for your personal financial future. You play with the numbers a while longer until you're convinced the numbers truly represent the ideal way to evaluate mortgage-backed securities. You don't feel bad because you're certain that you've done your best to represent the value of securities as objectively as possible. Moreover, you aren't dealing with real cash. You're only playing with numbers that are many steps removed from cash. Would it surprise you to learn that Dr. Ariely and Dr. Gino both were um, uh, both are suspected of fudging their data, their numbers? 0.002. What's the big deal? We see the trend anyway. We know the trend. The data's not that clear. Let's just make it a little clearer. Let's have significant data. Because if we have this big, long-term experiment and we have sort of insignificant data, doesn't really show any big trends, well, that's not going to make the headlines, right? That's not going to get you tenured. So, that's the fudge factor. Now, this is not what he's in trouble for. This is what I'm describing from this book, The Fudge Factor. What he's in trouble from right now is something called the nudge factor. Let's see how I can explain this one. I suppose if I'm trying to be fair to them, they might say, when you sign at the bottom of your job application, I swear that I have not lied and I blah, 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 blah. They might say, if we move the position of that statement, signing that you will not lie, to the top of the document in the beginning, this might cause people to be more truthful on the document. I would argue, more nefariously, this nudging might be why I paid for $2,000 tickets to come to Thailand not long ago. Yes, that's right. The website was designed so ingeniously with so many extra clicks and pages and backclicks and default clicks that were bigger or smaller, that weren't the ones that were intuitive, but the ones that were profitable for them. Anyway, I ended up with the wrong flight, and they would not change it. So this is the nudge factor that he's in trouble with. And since I'm not as clear on that, I don't want to give more information that might be incorrect. I'll give my conclusion why I still think he's guilty at the end, why I don't think it's a mistake. I can say more about Dr. Miko's case, Gino's case, because they seized the laptop. They could see that certain the lines where the problems were like highlighted or cut and pasted. I'm not sure. I will say that the problematic areas in the data in Dr. Ariely's case were accessed by someone with his ID, his online ID, or his identity. So let me try to explain this. What happened, for example, in the Gino case. Okay, so I've actually taken graduate methodology, research methodology courses in 3 fields now, not by choice, I promise you, not my cup of tea. And I can tell you that I know quite a bit about that subject. However, nothing about statistics. And that is totally common. People could be incredibly advanced in their field, but they might need other people to help them with all the statistics unless they happen to also be an advanced mathematician, because it can get quite complicated, especially in the harder sciences where they do more quantitative research. So broadly speaking, qualitative research would be what might get done in the humanities by someone like me, dissecting a poem. There's not much to count. I mean, I guess you could say, see how many lines are exchanged or how many scenes certain 2 characters appear in a play or something like that, but it's not that interesting. Hard science, that's where pretty much your numbers, right? What is the temperature at which various liquids uh, reach boiling point, or one liquid reaches boiling points at various um, altitudes or pressures, air pressures. Okay, so in between is the social sciences, like the people we're talking about here today, in psychology, that sort of thing. So sociology, et cetera, et cetera. They have sometimes a combination of both. So in the case of Gino's problematic data, the grad student who busted this whole thing wide open noticed that, among other things, there was a disconnect between the quantitative and the qualitative data. In other words, you might give a survey, which would be quantitative, right? Like, out of 7, how creepy do you find, networking with older male professors? um, and they might give a 7, right? And then that's the quantitative side. Then they'll also often collect qualitative data. So, it's a chance to say sort of things in your own words. So she was looking at these data sets, and this person put a 7 creepy, but then in the comment section, she used words like, empowering, exciting, interesting, inspirational. Yeah, they don't fit, right? So there was quite a lot of that. So that's the sort of problems that we're looking at. So the point is they caught them. They caught them with faking the data to make their results seem more impressive. All right, so we talked about all the different defenses that Dr. Ariely has prepared for himself, the minimizing, the collaboration, the storytelling, the environmental and medical defenses, or mitigations, the economics. And now I'm going to tell you why I think they are guilty. Means, motive, opportunity. The means, they were the leads on these studies, which, by the way, have multiple authors. So we have a bigger problem here. Either people are joining in putting their name to studies without being very aware of what's in the study, or colluding. Not 100% clear yet on what's going to happen with that. Means, motive. So the motive, ambition, I think, pure ambition. You'd be surprised. The academics can be very ambitious. In fact, Ariely quotes in The Honest Truth About Dishonesty Pablo Picasso, who said, "Good artists copy, great artists steal." By the way, he has other chapters like the upsides of lying. His next last chapter is the semi-optimistic conclusion. People don't cheat enough. Means, motive, opportunity. All right, so the opportunity again was they've got the dates and everything for this data manipulation. So as I was saying, I'm not qualified to talk on that stuff, and neither are any of the YouTubers that are talking about it. However, I need you to know that people who are exposing this are qualified to speak on it. They are data experts. These are the ones that you would contract to do the data for your studies, and they know how to look at this data and see where it was manipulated, why and how it was manipulated, things, all kinds of things like mathematical. If you've ever taken like a test, maybe a pre-employment test, and you notice they have the same questions more than once, why that is that they'll design instruments with internal checks to see how you're managing your, people want to be well perceived. They want to be perceived well, so they can manage how they present themselves. So they can have questions like that just to check that factor of you. But these guys are way beyond that. They're in the sort of how to describe it. They are professional statisticians, and they are the ones that we can trust when they say something's wonky here. Um, Finally, there's this. Academics are conflicted too. When I reflect on the ubiquity of conflicts of interest and how impossible they are to recognize in our own lives, I have to acknowledge that I'm susceptible to them as well. We academics are sometimes called upon to use our knowledge as consultants and expert witnesses. Shortly after I got my first academic job, I was invited to a large law firm to be an expert witness. I knew some established colleagues provided expert testimonial as regular side job for which they were paid handsomely. Out of curiosity, I asked to see transcripts of the old cases, and they showed me a few, and I was surprised to discover how one-sided their use of the research findings was. I was also somewhat shocked to see how derogatory they were in their reports about the opinions and qualifications of the expert witness, representing the other side, who most often was also a respectable academic. Even so, I decided to try it out, not for the money, of course. I was paid quite a bit to give my expert opinion. Very early in the case, I realized the lawyers I was working with trying to plant ideas in my mind that would buttress their case. They did not do it forcefully or saying certain things that would be good for their client. Instead, they asked me to describe all the research that was relevant to the case. They suggested that some of the less favorable findings for their position might have methodological flaws, and that the research supporting their view were very important and well done. They also paid me warm compliments each time I interpreted research in a way that was useful to them. After a few weeks, I discovered I was quickly adopting the viewpoints of those who were paying me. The whole experience made me doubt whether it's at all possible to be objective when one is paid for his or her opinion. And now I'm writing about my lack of objectivity. I'm sure that no one will ever ask me to be an expert witness again. And maybe that's a good thing. Well, I think Dr. Ariely might have to be a witness in his own case and in his own defense soon. And I think here he has prepared his defense in advance. The last little piece I'll mention is that when people come under scrutiny for things like this, very often other problems pop up. And while they might be unrelated, it might be a pattern and does cause one to view the allegations a little more seriously. In the case of Gino, there have been clear and egregious instances of plagiarism, which have been found now. In the case of Dr. Ariely, I'm not aware of that yet, early days. However, I did learn of a very disturbing occasion, if indeed it's true. If this is true, I would say it's almost certain that Dr. Ariely's mistakes, problems in this data set are almost certainly, at best, willfully ignorant, and at worst, straight up fraud. So there's something called the Human Review Board. Whenever you're going to do research involving human beings, you have to get approval from the Human Review Board. I mean, this could be things as simple as they might ask you to change a question in one of those surveys I was talking about, if it's felt that the question might so destabilize your view of yourself. Like you might see yourself as an ethical person. This question makes you reflect and realize, oh, I'm not ethical at all. And how does that damage me as a human going out away from this research and living my life? So very careful, these human review boards, and very, very serious, very big deal. Apparently, Dr. Ariely ran a study without clearance from the HRB that involved ECT, okay, electroshock therapy. If that is true, and he was removed from the study and, as lead author of the study and everything, so they caught it. But if that's true, that shows a level of callous disregard that I think makes it pretty hard to imagine that this sort of person might not do some shady things. Sorry to say. Now, let me end by once again saying two things. First, I cheated. I cherry picked from this book. I told you about half of the contents of this book, basically. Right? The parts that are painting the views that I, this characterization that I'm developing. I will say, and I promise you from what I read, I didn't carefully read every word of this book. Couldn't stand to. But there wasn't anything I found that was running very, counter to my narrative. The rest is just, beside the point. He begins, this book basically is pretty easy to characterize. He begins by talking about smork. What is smork? And then he ends with religion. So smork is the simple model of rational crime. Oh, don't get me started on prisoner's dilemma and game theory. And then he ends, in the end, he talks about the Ten Commandments and why some people believe the Sabbath is the most important one, because if you have time to reflect, you will naturally correct yourself on all these other points. Talks about Jacob the liar, of the patriarchs. So that's sort of the arc of his book and his arguments and developments, which is what I would have presented to you if it were not for the fact that first we have to figure out if anything that this author is saying is reliable at all, which is important in a non-fiction book. All right, so secondly, let me reiterate how important this is. They have been caught. When people do research, other people check it. It's called Tier 1 peer reviewed. People that are your peers, they have the same levels of education and training that you have, or even more. Check your work. They try to duplicate your work. They were not able to duplicate these studies. This began to be a problem 5 times, 6 times. We're not getting the same results. What's going on here? Other people, advanced data statisticians, go in and look at, degrees of variance and, validity and falsifiability, all kinds of things. And so, please still have faith in our academics and our intellectuals. I know the states especially can be quite anti-intellectual, and this is sort of spreading and is becoming dangerous as people refuse to accept things like climate change and things like this, or public health things, where they want to distrust the experts. The experts are the experts because they spend all their days and nights thinking about something like, sewage water treatment, or things that you and I don't want to think about for 2 seconds. They dedicate their life to that. They're the people who know that subject best. Yes, let's have monitors and make sure they're not completely off in their own kingdom, because they can do whatever. But let's also trust them. When I have a question on that subject, that's the person I want to go to. Thank you very much for listening to my review of Don Ariely's Confession, The Honest Truth About Dishonesty.